welcome everyone. My name is David Oxtoby, president of Pomona College, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. It's a very busy day for us here on campus. It's not only is it zip code day, 9/17/2011 is the zip code for Claremont, so it's September 17, 2011. There's all sorts of things going on in the village. There's a football game going on. Last night in this very space we had a wonderful concert by Thomas Hampton. So music, art, sports, everything's going on quite busily here in Claremont and Pomona College. But here we are joined together for a very special symposium to introduce an exciting exhibit which has been mounted at the Pomona College Museum of Art. The exhibit, of course, is called It Happened at Pomona, Art at the Edge of Los Angeles, 1969 to 1973. And it is the very first of the whole series of Pacific Standard Time exhibits taking place throughout the Southern California area. So without further ado, let me invite our director of the Pomona College Museum of Art, Kathleen Howe, professor of art history, to introduce the speaker today. Kathleen.
Thank you, David. Thank you all for being here. Sorry, we're starting a little bit late, but we're hearing reports of dreadful traffic. So don't look askance at people who come in late. They may have just been trapped on the 210, and feel sympathetic. I'd like to welcome you to this first program in the series of exhibitions and programs presented by the Pomona College Museum of Art, called It Happened at Pomona, Art at the Edge of LA, 1969 to 1973. But before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to take a moment to describe how the program will unfold. After Professor Crow's remarks, Pomona College Museum of Art senior curator and intellectual engine behind the entire Pomona project, Rebecca McGrew, will introduce Hal Glicksman and Mowry Baden, who will be joined by Tom Crow in a conversation about the historical moment then and its implications now. I'd ask that you hold any questions you have until after their conversation, and while we're happy to take questions in the hall, I'd encourage you rather to continue the conversation or to ask your questions outside at the reception, which will be directly in front of the museum to follow this. It Happened at Pomona, Art at the Edge of LA, 1969 to 73 is a set of 3 interlocking exhibitions and accompanying public events which began on August 30th and will continue through the academic year, a project that is documented in an exhaustive catalog. The project is part of Pacific Standard Time, and at Pomona College, Pacific Standard Time is amplified by a web of curricular collaborations across disciplines, and I'm especially pleased to welcome participating students and faculty members to today's program. Pacific Standard Time itself is a collaboration of more than 60 cultural institutions across Southern California coming together for several months this year to tell the story of the birth of the Los Angeles art scene and how it became a major new force in the art world. Each institution is making its own contribution to this grand-scale story of artistic innovation and social change, told through a multitude of simultaneous exhibitions and public programs. Pacific Standard Time explores and celebrates the significance of the crucial years after World War II through the tumultuous period of the 1960s and 70s. Initiated through $10 million in grants from the Getty Foundation, Pacific Standard Time involves cultural institutions of every size and character across Southern California, and we are very pleased to be among them. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Getty Research Institute and the Getty Foundation. Certainly they have been generous funders without whom we could not have accomplished the project that will unfold over this year. But they have also been, in a very real way, our partners and fellow explorers. And as I express our gratitude to the big entity that is the Getty Foundation, I only wish there were time to acknowledge by name the many, many individuals who make up the Getty and with whom we have worked so productively over the past years. I would also like to acknowledge and thank all of the friends of Pomona who, through individual gifts, endowed funds, and foundation support made our participation possible. To name but a few, Janet Inskeep Benton, Louise and John Bryson, Emily and David Horowitz, Carlton and Laura Seaver, the Rembrandt Club of Pomona College, and the Pasadena Arts Alliance. Truly, without your help, we could not have done this. I'd also like to thank the Dean of the College, Cecilia Conrad, and President David Oxtoby for literally not throwing us out of their offices when they found out the scope of the project that we proposed, and for continuing to offer their advice and support and good counsel in this lead up. And I'd like to recognize the intellectual engine behind this project, the curators of the exhibition, Pomona Senior Curator Rebecca McGrew and her co-curator Glenn Phillips, Principal Project Specialist and Consulting Curator in the Department of Architecture and Contemporary Art at the Getty Research Institute. Special thanks are due to the research team assembled almost 4 years ago, Ms. McGrew, Mr. Phillips, Dr. Maurice Shirkus, Professor Thomas Crow, Helene Weiner, and Hal Glicksman, and to the many artists, alums, students past and present who shared their stories and contributed their research. We all thank you very much. On another note, I'd like to just mention the museum staff. One of the things that museums do, as do Performing Arts Company, is to make something look effortless, so that as you're sitting in the audience or as you're walking through a gallery, you have no sense of the work that went into something. This was an enormous project, and it was brought together by perhaps the best staff on the face of the earth, I'll just say that. Rebecca McGrew, Steve Kamba, Gary Murphy, Debbie Wilson, Susan Jensen, Jessica Wimbley, Terry Geis have all been terrific, not least of which is organizing a way to be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So now to the real meat of the reason we're meeting here. There are a number of reasons it's especially fitting to introduce to you as our keynote speaker, Professor Thomas Crow. He's an internationally respected art historian. To very briefly summarize his vitae, he is Professor of Modern Art at NYU Institute of Fine Arts and the Associate Provost for the Arts at NYU. Previously, he served as the chair of the Yale Department of Art History, where he was the Robert Lehman Professor of the History of Art. He's held academic appointments at the University of Chicago, Princeton University, University of Michigan, and University of Sussex in England. He's the author of several books that have come to define the practice of art history for this generation: Painters and Public Life in 18th Century Paris and Emulation, Making Artists for Revolutionary France, explored the cultural context that informed art at the beginning of the modern period. In Modern Art in the Common Culture and the Rise of the 60s, American Art in the Era of Dissent, he addressed the interpenetration of avant-garde art and mass culture that is the hallmark of contemporary art. But more than his standing as an art historian and a scholar, his participation here today is especially fitting, for it was under his leadership as director of the Getty Research Institute from 2000 to 2007 that I think the seeds of Pacific Standard Time were planted. He expanded the focus of the research and archival program of the GRI to explore the post-war period in Southern California art, beginning with a push to collect the oral histories of the artists, curators, critics, and patrons, and then in assisting art institutions in the region to archive the historical record sitting in file cabinets and perhaps in danger of being discarded. The projects begun under his direction have culminated in the rich scholarship that underpins Pacific Standard Time. A scholar's suspicion of totalizing histories, in this case, a totalizing history that said that post-war American art is a New York story, led to the projects that are expanding the historical record, complicating and enriching our understanding of the history of the art in the late 20th century. And if his critical acumen as art historian and his key role in beginning the process of writing the history of this period were not enough, he lived the period. here at Pomona. An alum of the class of 1969, engaged in thinking about and making art in Claremont, he offers a unique perspective on art at the edge of LA. I give you Professor Thomas Crow, and thank you very much.
Well, many, many thanks, Kathleen, for that really, really warm and gratifying introduction. I have many thank yous of my own, but probably given the length of our program today, I should keep them very succinct. I can't help just talking about how gratifying it's been working with Rebecca McGrew from the very start on this and seeing something that meant so much to me personally unfold. And Glenn Phillips, of course, who I first knew as a graduate student at Yale and who came to the Research Institute while I was there, and seeing his talents, well, they were already plenty in evidence, but just bloom even further and have such a really great effect on the whole Pacific Standard Time complex that we're now about to witness. Now, I was very appreciative of Kathleen's acknowledgement that, you know, when Andrew Perchuk and I got to the Research Institute, Andrew also had come from Yale with me, and he was working on California art for his research, and said, you know, it's there, it hasn't been done, you know, it's really our duty. We would be failing, really, in our mandate if we didn't tackle this. And, you know, it would have been very hard to know that what we're seeing unfold this year would be the result of that kind of germ of determination that started then. And, you know, I couldn't feel better about it. Coming back to Pomona, of course, to do this, introduces a certain circularity in that I would never personally have been in a position to catalyze this. Most likely never have been an art historian at all if I hadn't been a student here in Claremont at the exact time covered by the exhibition. And I think Pomona can fairly be said to lie at the heart of a deep history of the Pacific Standard Time Project. Why it deserves that standing is something that I've tried to lay out in my contribution to the catalog. And in that essay, I was concerned not to be taken as some kind of partisan homeboy, just, you know, advancing a parochial case for the importance of Pomona and Claremont in art history. So I tried as best I could to write it in the dispassionate voice of historical observation and let that support the claim that I make at the outset of the essay, that is, quoting myself, the art being made and shown at Pomona College between 1969 and 1973 was as important as any being made and shown anywhere else in the world. Now, to make that argument, I thought it needed to be written without reliance on any colored personal recollections. To be fair and to do justice to the artists whose work I was trying to bring to the fore and bring to the reader's consciousness. Of course, you'll be hearing directly from two of the principal movers in that account, Mowry Baden and Hal Glicksman, as soon as I've done these remarks. But their true authority in these matters seemed to leave me with just two choices in the direction of my remarks. I could try to recapitulate the kind of overview that you can find in the catalog That is, do a sort of art historian's lecture telling you what I think you should think about the work in question. But, I mean, we have to do that. But I think that sort of exercise lives much more comfortably in print. And the alternative was to attempt something more personal, something more local to the experience of a young, unsophisticated Pomona student from coastal San Diego in the later 1960s, namely myself. Something more like a history from below. And though I won't pretend not to know the things that I think I know now, I thought I'd attempt a small chronicle of discovery, a prelude to the more salient dialogue you'll be hearing from our discussants, and in the process try to map some of the terrain as it evolved in the years before 1969, which happened to be the year of my own Pomona graduation. For reasons of economy, it seemed to me best to structure things around a series of two encounters I had at the old Montgomery Art Center, the predecessor of the Pomona Museum, with one side step to the old Lang Gallery at Scripps. I'll start with the spring of 1966, a time that might seem like a sort of hiatus in this story. James Turrell had graduated the year before. Chris Baden, my classmate, was still intent on becoming an architect. I myself was no particular art follower at that juncture. But I find myself in that spring drawn into the gallery by an installation of senior thesis work by John Ware, class of '66. Here you see a portrait from the '66 yearbook. Now, what attracted me to the exhibition, I can't really recall, but there was the unusual enticement of hearing the music from Meet the Beatles wafting out of the gallery. Now, once inside, the source of the music was hard to find. In the end, one could locate it inside a painting, one of a group of large geometric abstractions in nothing but broad bands of orange and blue. No visual document of the show seems to exist, except for this utterly misleading image also from the '66 yearbook. And it's a double shame, because to call these works paintings, certainly in 1966, took some liberties with the normal definition of the medium. As opposed to being just flat, as this one of the half dozen works appears in this reproduction, they stood a mile out from the wall, or at least a good foot, anyway. And I've tried to convey that in this manipulation I did of the yearbook photo, so that they were like boxes, sealed in bright interior house paint. Their supports consisted of canvas stretched over plywood solid forms, and inside one of them, a horizontal format one, an invisible tape player kept the early Beatles on continuous repeat. Now, it was visually and experientially like nothing I'd ever encountered in the name of art. The closest visual correlative that I could suggest, if you're trying to, picture these works fully, is indeed immediately to hand in Chris Baden's sculpture in the courtyard, which was made the year right after Ware's senior show, which features, as you can see, a parallel geometry, now fully in the round, and a parallel contrast between two hues and two highly contrasting tonal values, light and dark contrasts. And the narrower color panels in the Baden sculpture are just about the same size as the color panels were in the Ware, to the best of my recollection. And to try to make that a little more vivid, I've done another digital recreation of my memory and Ware's verbal account of them, which I got from him a few weeks ago, so that we could think of the paintings as looking rather something like the simulacrum on the right. Now, for the art historically conscious, 1966 was also the year in which Bryce Marden made his storied debut in New York with canvases covered by large, simple color areas. Now, these have entered, you know, the art history textbooks and standard museological chronologies, Marden making an expected sort of intervention into an established line of development marked by names like Ad Reinhardt and Frank Stella. The style of the presentation, the Bickert Gallery in '66 was decorous, his material of vaguely precious beeswax encaustic, a prestige medium linked to the authority of early Jasper Johns. Now, Ware, with no knowledge of Marden's parallel innovation, had crafted his brasher statement in ordinary house paints out of a different and I think more original lineage. Now, just to step back a moment, like other non-Californians in this story, Ware had discovered Pomona almost by accident, stopping off on a return trip from Los Angeles to his native Oklahoma City. And like Ed Ruscha and Joe Good a few years before him, he came to Southern California with the dual aim of getting out of Oklahoma and being an artist in a more familiar Southwestern environment. He'd been encouraged since childhood to pursue art and already had a way with a brush and with a kind of competent apprentice manner. He linked up with Pomona instructor Salvatore Grippi, Grippi then pursuing, as you can see in this gallery shot, a sort of high-keyed homage to Giorgio Morandi's still life manner. Ware graduated too early to take advantage of Guy Williams's bracingly concrete approach to painting, as you see in this detail from Slamfoot Brown. That came after, well, Williams arrived at Pomona after Ware's graduation. It might be a connection that one, would leap to, but in fact, the timing doesn't quite work out. Anyway, with Grippi's encouragement, he won a scholarship just before his senior year to the Yale Summer School of Art and Music in rustic Litchfield County, from which he returned doing paintings like the one you're seeing both behind him and on the easel in this full version of the '65 photo. All gestural brushiness with some schematic figurative elements thrown in. By the way, that's Phil Reich down on the floor, the future new wave sommelier at Michael's restaurant in Santa Monica. But in the course, or over the course of the coming year, Ware threw that entire manner of painting aside, reinventing his art in order to produce the precociously sophisticated statement he would make in his senior show. But the sources, let's see, have I got my, oh, sorry, I don't want that yet. Spoiled a little twist in the story. But his sources were not the blue chip genealogy assumed by a Bryce Marden. He says that he went back to the art history books to recover the abstraction of the Russian suprematists and constructivists from the years around the 1917 revolution. But where did all this quasi-sculptural projection and the idea of an installation as a composite work, where did that come from? He cites two kinds of formative experiences. The then gallery director and professor Nicholas Sikovsky took enough of an interest in him to take him along regularly to gallery openings in Los Angeles, to Nick Wilder's, to Irving Blum's Ferris Gallery. So he met people like Billy Al Bengston and Kenny Price and so on, you know, still while a Pomona undergraduate. Started to get the measure of what it meant to pursue a professional art career well in advance of what most students his age would have understood. At the same time, he was pursuing his other talent as a drummer with a Beverly Hills-based band that started out as a surf music outfit called the Rogues, and then morphed under the influence of Velvet Underground and Frank Zappa into the West Coast pop art experimental band. And you see the same John Ware behind the drum kit in this photo. With their portable light show, this band, despite the sort of nerdy evidence of the photograph, became a big draw in clubs and in society parties all over the West Side. In Ware's mind, the two spheres came to resemble one another. The art he saw at the openings appeared to him like props in a theater of manipulative socializing of the kind that he observed at the parties in the Hollywood Hills. So his own painting would contrive to condense that compromised situation into one visually powerful statement, with the idea, I would guess, of conflating the lost idealism of the early Russian avant-garde with cynical Hollywood-style corruption, the slightly cheesy-sounding, out-of-date Beatles providing the party ambience. Now, not that I could detect any of that when I walked in off the quad that day, but I knew that I was seeing something being presented as contemporary art unlike any of the tepid models for that category that I carried in my head. And it's worth remembering that this would have looked new and fresh anywhere in '66. Now, my reaction was no doubt colored by my knowing more about Ware as a musician than as an artist. I knew that he had played in high school with the great Oklahoma Native American guitarist Jesse Ed Davis. This friendship put Ware into a much more august musical circle than the Rogues and their subsequent incarnations. Davis migrating to Los Angeles at about the same time to become the mainstay first of Taj Mahal's band, and soon to provide really sought-after musical support for people on the level of former Beatles in their newer and far more hip transformations. Jesse Ed is somebody you always see right at their shoulders. Now, I'd seen Ware and Davis play together at this old Smudge Pot. And so Ware was, for me, the epitome of the hip senior. He, you know, being aware of his progress, I knew that he had stayed in visual art long enough to start an MFA up at UC Santa Barbara, but ended up back in music, joining Emmylou Harris's all-star backing band. And you see him here seated between Harris and lead guitar master James Burton. This is the group, the so-called Hot Band, that was named by the CMT channel as the best country music band in history, for what it's worth. And I can also say that Ware is back in music now in Denver with the band Reckless Red. Well, beyond the details of Ware's individual story, I think there's a lesson about art in Claremont contained in my first encounter with his example, which would be that the best artists who came from here or through here tended to have some other pursuit that was just as important to them as art making, and which being an artist informed or made somehow more reachable, more doable. Now, if you go down to San Diego to see the La Jolla Contemporary Art Museum's contribution to Pacific Standard Time, you'll see this light installation by James Turrell, Blue Stuck and Red Stuck from 1970, which impress mysteriously into the gallery wall forms and colors very similar to those that Ware had projected outwards into the gallery back in '66. Now, Ware and Turrell were friends, and Ware recalls, in a way that's a little at odds with the interview in the catalog, that Turrell took no art classes at all while they were at Pomona. His memory is that Turrell's Quaker convictions forbade him from making anything that had no practical use. So maybe ceramics qualified, and Turrell mentions those in his interview with Rebecca. But his majoring in psychology helped orient him toward the making of artworks like these two from '66 and '68 that had no material substance at all, and therefore, we can suppose, fell outside the strictures against impractical objects. By the time he retreated to the abandoned Mendota Hotel in Ocean Park, Santa Monica, he was making pieces called the Mendota stoppages that entailed no more than very precisely and selectively permitting streaks of light to enter from various apertures into the empty, darkened room. Not only psychology as an intellectual vocation, but rather famously aviation, provided Turrell with his own set of multiple identities, outside of which his art would really never have been what it is. That same year of 1966, failed to advance the slide. This is one of these utterly inadequate photographic captures of one of Turrell's Mendota stoppages. Okay, back to the same spring of '66. This massive work of wooden sculpture appeared in the Montgomery Gallery. Seen in this photograph with its maker, Claremont Graduate School student Robert Wilson. This was his MFA show. Now, to the best of my knowledge, living in obscurity in Ireland, Bob Wilson merits recognition here as another defining Claremont artist of the period, just prior to the Baden Glicksman moment. The piece we're seeing, like Ware's painting instruction, takes a certain cue from New York minimalism. And in Wilson's case, I think there might be an admixture of the related but distinct group of Park Place sculptors, but that's more of this kind of art historical minutiae that I think can be set aside here. I'm more interested in, as with the other figures, Turrell and Ware, of the kind of totality of his life in Claremont. Here he is later on Marston Quad, applying those talents to a float for one of Professor Richard Barnes's famous theatrical happenings of the era. There's a ruggedness about his hollow wooden forms, a lack of worry over geometric precision that gives them a certain rustic Old West look, which isn't out of keeping with the other side of his artistic personality, the one that in fact enjoyed the greater visibility at the time. There's maybe a cognate blocky symmetry to be seen in this poster, built around the heavy black silhouette of Ken Weaver, one member of the Fugs, the quintessential band of East Village art hippies, set off against an iridescent silver paper ground. Wilson and his wife, Cheryl Todd, then wife Cheryl Todd Wilson, were almost solely responsible for publicizing concerts at this venue, the Bank, which was located all the way across the LA basin in coastal Torrance. A vanity enterprise run by a couple of trust fund babies who just wanted to meet their favorite bands. Its organization and revenues were meager, so it fell to the Wilsons, all the way out here in Claremont, to do all the design, printing, and distribution of the handbill posters. Bob Wilson developed an elegant and economical style that could actually compete with the glowing, psychedelic, multicolored products of his San Francisco ballroom counterparts. But in his hands, all he needed was simple black line. He took advantage of that relative simplicity to lend his designs a rugged, old-timey, engraving sort of feel that went along with the back to the land ethos of the counterculture of the late 60s. For his signature, Wilson adopted, as you see in the bottom center of this poster, the elegant profile of an American buffalo. He could take the smoothly modeled flesh of Jacques-Louis David's dying Marat and render it in a knotty, chiseled series of planes in a staged design clash with the blandly loopy Flower Power logo supplied by the short-lived but brilliant San Francisco band Moby Grape. He included his self-portrait at the top of this design for British bluesman John Mayall, one of his best, I think, in terms of drawing elegance and layering of information. And in it, there's another cue as to the Wilsons' second vocation, to be seen underneath the rainbow-like semicircular type in the center. The poster work drew them close to the same music scene that had given John Ware his alternative identity. But their larger commitment lay in the realm of real wildlife, specifically South American tapirs. Behind their bungalow, which to the best of my memory was up on Central Avenue near Foothill, they housed first one and then two of these slightly uncanny animals, giving their place the air of an exotic farm. And there used to be a lot of parties there where the viewing of the tapirs was one of the real highlights of the experience. Though the animals were confined, I think the Wilsons intended to raise awareness of endangered habitats in the incipient ecological awareness that the counterculture was fostering. And Cheryl Todd, in fact, as you see her here with the bigger of the two, remains active to this day in the cause of tapir conservation. Now, none of this seemed in the least surprising to me. A connection between art making and this sort of earthiness seemed to go with Claremont's situation at this liminal edge between suburban development and what were then the seemingly endless acres of lemon groves that persisted north of Foothill. To go down Baseline was just to be enclosed by citrus, walls of citrus. Arid and boulder-strewn as the rest of the landscape was, these very qualities seem to be entirely congruent with the raku ceramics ethos that Paul Soldner had created at Scripps among the undergraduates there and also the graduate potters in the Claremont Graduate School MFA program. Soldner had evolved an improvisatory way-of-life approach to ceramics in adapting Japanese raku techniques to an American sensibility. Building kilns and wheels, mixing glazes, making quick aesthetic decisions, courting accidents, occasionally catastrophic ones, and the firing and sudden cooling of these vessels. Soldner's presence at Scripps made ceramics a sign and vehicle for some of the most up-to-date artistic sensibilities in the LA Basin. And therefore, that became the nucleus of artistic subculture as I first encountered it in Claremont. And one of the things that his students did was colonize the old Midway Tavern up on Foothill Boulevard, a rough-hewn bar made out of native boulders to give Claremont its own artist's bar. In my day, the potter Billy Meeks managed the place. Its sort of combination of hipness and seediness inspired the thriller writer Kem Nunn to anchor his 1992 novel Pomona Queen around the squalid decline of the Midway. But he does allow that from its high ground up on the upland line, quote, the lights of the Pomona Valley could be seen in all their mediocre splendor, cast among the dark folds of the surrounding hills. So ceramics and the Midway represent my own more active rather than contemplative entry into this scene. My first art teacher, Pitzer Professor Dennis Parks, was a recent product of the same CGS grad program. So I started my brief period making art myself, and through his network got my first jobs using what drawing skills I possessed. And if you've looked along the timeline or at the frontispiece of the catalog, you'll see one outcome in this poster of mine, which has been so generously included, and one that makes no apology for its debt to the example of Bob Wilson. I was learning, after all. Its destination, in fact, was mainly a T-shirt that meant to capitalize on the brief period of hipness enjoyed by the Midway, which Meeks silkscreened and printed up, and I got a $25 bar tab in return for drawing this. But its 1970 date gets me a little ahead of my chronology, and as we're hanging around Scripps now, I want to go back to the old Lang Gallery in 1967. The round of master's degree shows in that spring included the startling installation by Bastian Otter that you see in these partial views. When you walked in, you found yourself immersed in quasi-paintings, three-dimensional objects, things that seemed like they had fallen out of paintings, variously wall-mounted, freestanding, or floor-hugging elements in a calculated palette of saturated colors and reflective silver and gold paint. Sadly, no longer extant, the dozen or so elements, I think, still shine through in these documentary photographs. Here's another, as exuberantly pop in a manner that bears little resemblance to the recognized exemplars of pop art, either in Los Angeles or anywhere else. Now, unlike Ware or Wilson, whose hold on public memory is either precarious or non-existent, Bastian Otter, in the years since his death at sea in 1975, has come to possess a renown on the order of Turrell's. But the years he spent in Claremont from '65 until the early 1970s would vie with any tale of obscurity and lack of recognition. What visitors to his MFA show could not have known is how much of the subsequent work in performance and photography and film that followed, which are the basis for his posthumous fame, How much of that is already laid out in this self-invented hybrid medium he contrived for his Lang show. Now, unpacking this frankly autobiographical undertaking is going to take just a little biography, one that reaches back to the darkest episodes in European history. Otter's father and namesake had been a Dutch Reformed minister in the north of Holland, renowned for his personal fortitude. Among other exploits, in 1936, he had successfully completed a journey from their home in Groningen to Istanbul on a bicycle. But the younger Bastian had never had the chance to know him, as he was executed in the closing years of the war by the occupying Germans for giving assistance to Jewish refugees. And behind him, you see the shattered bicycle after its collision with the brick-hard pavement. The uncle of his friend, schoolmate, and fellow artist, Herr van Elk, met the same fate. And that tragic coincidence indirectly helped bring them together in Southern California. In 1963, the 21-year-old Otter was heaved up on a dock in San Diego, a castaway exotic enough to attract the attention of the LA Times in this small story in the old regional section of the paper. He was sailing from Morocco with a set designer from MGM, but a hapless sailor who had to be rescued and towed into San Diego Bay. Now, that symmetry might appear uncanny, but his fatal, plausibly good faith attempt in 1975 to cross the North Atlantic alone in a 4-meter sailboat doubtless subsumed a conscious ambition to reenact the manner of his displacement from the Netherlands, the voyage that launched his mature career as an artist on the west coast of the United States. His old schoolmate Van Elk was already living in LA, studying art history at Immaculate Heart College, that small, forward-looking institution run in Hollywood by the nuns of the Immaculate Heart Order. And it was to Van Elk that Otter made his way after parting company with his hapless sailing companion. Now, Van Elk is going to be figuring prominently in the subsequent iterations of It Happened at Pomona. But why had he traveled to California in the first place? And this is another instance of the paths or genealogies that led to the unlikely convergence and coincidence of such remarkable talents in one place at this time. The answer lies in his father's and his late uncle's profession. Pete and John Van Elk had been pioneers in strip cartooning and funny character animation in Holland. Pete Van Elk then was recruited to the Hollywood animation industry in 1962 as a background artist for Hanna-Barbera Productions, the company that specialized in those half-hour television cartoons like Huckleberry Hound and Yogi Bear, dominating the field by combining clever character development with ruthlessly streamlined and simplified technical procedures. So we've got set design, animated cartoons, Immaculate Heart College. I mean, how do these coordinates help make sense of Otter's early direction as seen in Claremont in 1967? Now, the progress of his work suggests to me taking these points of reference in reverse order. His first contacts in LA had plainly left a vivid impression, to judge by a work he did when he enrolled at Otis called Hurtful in the Park, a unique book of drawings and texts that he did in 1964. In the coordination on its pages of freehand printing and calligraphy with the bold bands and grids of pigment, I don't think there's any mistaking the salient example of Sister Mary Corita Kent's silk-screened posters. She, of course, was the prominent, increasingly internationally famous, and in some circles, chiefly the circle of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, notorious public face for the art program at Immaculate Heart. Otter's cover at the top of his book, in its cursive script and broad horizontal division of the sheet, comes closest to her signature style. In the opening, you see at the bottom, the boldly biblical whosoever stretches across one page in a parody of Christ's homilies. Whosoever shall wear baggy pants and think of yesterday shall inherit the park. But Otter's travesties of Corita Kent's earnestness and scriptural cadences don't cut too deeply. His homage to her example and its underlying concept of graphic communication, I think, comes far more strongly to the fore. So by the end of the 1960s decade, it has been convenient to see Otter within a genealogy of conceptual art practice, phototext-based work that is consistent with the kind of textbook examples of New York instances of this kind of artwork. But his actual formation calls attention to an alternative source, first of all, in Corita Kent's silkscreen prints, along with her readiness to confront with an immediate fervor the moral import of great events like the Watts Rebellion of 1965. Otter's instincts, despite or maybe because of his clergyman father's commanding moral example, were far more inward-turning, skeptical, and contemplative. An endless examination of the individual's capacity for autonomous agency in the face of overwhelming impersonal forces. A seriousness that he tended to deflect into disarmingly comic poses and scenarios. The scene for this investigation in his art increasingly became the hearth and home, which he acknowledged as a traditional preoccupation of Dutch art. Amid the evocation of natural forces in his MFA installation, we find a bridal portrait. His own bride, Mary Sue Anderson, appears in outline pressed against a fictional window by an actual desk with uneven legs with a saw embedded into its canted top. The two of them had met when they were fellow students at Otis. Her father actually was the dean. When she found a teaching job in San Bernardino, they settled in Claremont, and where they moved into a bungalow much like Cheryl and Bob Wilson's bungalow, but south on Indian Hill. Neither of these houses, of course, still exists. Boss started in the MFA program as much, he said, for the chance to take Claremont graduate philosophy courses as to pursue art. And the scholarly epicure became another of his comic personae, as in this 68 self-portrait, the artist as consumer of extreme comfort. And the 67 show he conceived as a synthesis of these dual ambitions. He called it Implosion, and submitted a recondite explanatory text to the faculty, which precociously anticipates something of the installation aesthetic that Hal Glicksman would be putting into practice 2 years later. It includes the assertion that, quote, unoccupied areas of this environment are not considered empty since they comprise the arena for the commixtion of the different parts and their eventual implosion. The vocabulary is eccentric, but I think the point comes across. To this end, the gallery portion of Implosion exuberantly entered the realm of set design and decoration, even special effects as in the cascading Niagara Falls, which pours down from the ceiling to ripple out onto the floor in folds of fabric, rather like an Eva Hesse sculpture before the fact. In a corner established by two paintings, we've already seen this, one a head-on view of a cyclist, the other a red brick wall surmounted by cartoon Hanna-Barbera type blue sky and puffy clouds. The actual broken bike strewn on the floor attests to an event somewhere on a scale between movie stunt and fatal impact. His graphic style was in fact no leap at all from the animated cartoon work to which Van Elk's father was contributing. And it also took advantage of simplified and repeated cutouts, which were not dissimilar to the separations required in Sister Carita's multicolored serograph prints. Now, with his early debt to Immaculate Heart, Otter had a natural affinity to fellow student Bob Wilson's poster sensibility, and he put some effort into the one that advertised his MFA show, adapting another drawing called The Artist Contemplating the Forces of Nature. The implosion poster incorporates a photographic self-portrait in which Otter, rather like the consumer of extreme comfort, nonchalantly smokes a pipe poised on a chair perched atop a section of roof shingles. Behind him, a flat painted backdrop with that cloud and treetop cartoon appearance. Apart from signaling the kind of antic character of the installation, it forecasts the salient importance that the bungalow he shared with Mary Sue would carry as both object and idea through the now famous work that followed. And I think we can wonder how he would have gone forward outside of the domestic scale of the Claremont townscape. That is, if he hadn't been able to colonize the exterior of his house, effectively reversing the spatial relationship of architectural container to human documents. The 1969 stage photograph, All My Clothes, laid out the empty signifiers of the artist's self across the roof of that increasingly iconic Claremont bungalow, the container that presumably sheltered him from sight. There's an intimation also of remains and dismemberment in All My Clothes, which simultaneously resembles the aftermath of a kind of Buster Keaton silent comedy tornado. Both peril and comedy converge in the closely related film performances of 1970, the first of which, Fall 1, Los Angeles, was enacted on the same site. Where he, as you've seen, descends from the spot where he had perched for his MFA poster to disappear from view. The extreme connoisseur of comfort, or the connoisseur of extreme comfort, falls to ruin into the overgrown shrubbery beneath the porch. Fall to Amsterdam, its necessary complement, finds him back on his native ground. Reenacting in real time the bicycle, self-portrait, and fallen accident debris from the implosion installation in which his father's memory is so deftly and poignantly conflated. When he outfitted his 12-foot sailing craft in 1975, intending to complete a multi-part artwork titled In Search of the Miraculous, with a solo voyage from Cape Cod to Amsterdam, He created a minimal household to sustain him on the journey. And it appears now to have been an explosion of the galley stove that brought him to his fatal end off the Irish coast. Though he undertook his voyage in full confidence in its success, the outcome does literalize the vanishing or disappearance of the self enacted on film in the two falls that you've just seen. It was characteristic of art in Claremont, and I should say the black and white photos at the bottom are the recovered hull of his boat called the Ocean Wave. So it was characteristic, I was starting to say, characteristic of art in Claremont, and this is one of the thesis of my essay in the catalog, that it took on the dimensions of a total way of life, demanding fulfillment in much larger and much more intimate spheres beyond the confines of a strictly professional art career, including marriages, dwellings, pets, music, motorcycles, airplanes, the surface of the globe. Anything and everything was potentially drawn into the kind of vortex of an identification between the self and an artistic career that was as thoroughgoing as the examples I've been discussing, Otter's most of all. But the paradox of that largeness of conception is that it becomes all the easier to fall out of the art world sight altogether, as my three main subjects have variously done. Because it's useful to remember how many years passed after 1975 before Otter's legacy began to be brought to light, as that of another disappearing artist, the late Christopher D'Arcangelo, is being very belatedly revived now as we speak. It could be said that art is only what we can remember, that art objects are just momentary relays of memory, which may or may not persist over time. Often, like John Ware's paintings, they're beyond recovery. Or, like Bob Wilson's deserved place in the Frisco-centric history of the 1960s rock poster, has been, his place and face have been nearly extinguished. His name in one definitive compendium turned into anonymous. But as long as they live somewhere, even in the fragmentary, disputable recollections of your present speaker, an art history is still possible that is not hostage to inventories of cosseted objects. That is, an art history conducted in the spirit of the first serious art that I knew, and which I've tried to convey as best I can all these years on to you this afternoon. So thank you very much for your attention. We will, at this point, do a quick transition. I will call our esteemed discussants, Professor Mowry Baden and Hal Glicksman, up to this round table. Because of the time, we'll carry right on, but if you need to leave the room, don't be hesitant. So I think at this juncture, the thing to do is to have Hal and Mowry come up to the stage. Thank you.